The photograph was still on the mantle when I packed my bags. I didn't plan to look at it. I was moving fast, the way you move when stillness becomes dangerous. Pulling open the closet, reaching past the dry cleaning I hadn't touched in weeks, fingers closing around the handle of the suitcase I'd carried to Portland from Sacramento the year I married Colton Hale. But I passed the mantle and I stopped, and the photograph stopped me the way it always had, even when everything else in that house had become foreign and wrong. It was from the night of our 5th anniversary. The restaurant, Aurelius, on the waterfront, had strung white lights along the terrace railing, and the Columbia River was black and silver behind us. In the photograph, Colton had his arm around my waist and I was leaning into him, my head turned slightly, and if you looked at my face you could see something that wasn't quite a smile. I'd told myself for months that it was just the angle. The camera catching me mid-breath. Some artifact of light. Standing there with my suitcase in my hand, I finally admitted what it actually was. It was the expression of someone who already knew. Not what would happen next. Not the specific shape the night would take, or the sound of 400 people going quiet before 400 people started to laugh. But something underneath that, older than that particular evening. A knowledge I'd been carrying so long it had become posture, become the way I held my shoulders in certain rooms, become the particular set of my jaw whenever the Hale family was in the same building. I set the suitcase down. I picked up the photograph and I looked at it for the count of 10, and then I laid it face down on the mantle, gently, the way you set down something that still has the power to hurt you. Then I went back to packing. My name is Presley Kane. I grew up in Sacramento, in a neighborhood where the streets were wide and the houses sat back from the sidewalk behind old magnolia trees that dropped their petals in April like something was letting go. My mother used to collect them in a bowl on the kitchen windowsill. She said the smell reminded her of the South, of the place her own mother had come from before the family moved west, and even though I'd never been to Georgia or Alabama or any of those places, I understood what she meant. That a smell can be a kind of inheritance, something passed down without anyone meaning to pass it on. My father, Wade Kane, was not the kind of man who collected magnolia petals. He was the kind of man who noticed things. That was the quietest way I knew to say what he was, because the larger version of it, the factual, professional version, was something he'd spent most of my childhood being careful about. Not hiding, exactly. More like he kept it in a separate drawer, and he only opened that drawer when the situation required it, and most of the time the situation didn't require it, so most of the time Wade Kane was just a man who drove a sensible car and coached my soccer team on Saturdays and made the best brisket in the county every 4th of July. He was also, as certain people would eventually learn, the sole owner of Kane Capital Partners, a Portland-headquartered private equity firm with 31 years of operating history and a portfolio valued, at its most recent independent audit, at just under $478 million. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That part comes later. What mattered, in the years before any of that mattered, was that Wade Kane raised me to be someone who finished sentences calmly. Who listened before responding. Who understood that the most powerful thing you could put in a room was a woman who refused to shrink, and who knew the difference between refusing to shrink and making a scene. Those two things look similar from the outside. They are not the same. I held on to that distinction on the night of our 5th anniversary. I held on to it so tightly I thought it might leave marks. I met Colton Hale at a fundraising gala in downtown Portland the autumn I turned 28. He was tall and easy in a room the way some men are, the kind of ease that reads as confidence until you know it well enough to see it's something more like practiced indifference to consequences. He laughed at the right moments. He found me across a crowded room and made it feel intentional. We talked for 2 hours and then he asked for my number, and I gave it to him because he was charming and the wine was good and the Columbia was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and sometimes that's enough for a beginning. I didn't tell him much about my father, not in those early months. Not because I was ashamed or secretive, but because it genuinely hadn't seemed important. My father had raised me not to lead with that. It wasn't a tactic. It was just how we'd always moved through the world. Quietly, without announcement, letting people respond to who we actually were instead of what we represented on a balance sheet. Colton's family, the Hales, were not like that. The Hales were from money the way certain old houses are from wood. It was structural, load-bearing, impossible to separate from the thing itself. Randall Hale, Colton's father, had built a regional commercial real estate portfolio out of Portland in the early 90s and had spent the decades since expanding it and, more importantly, talking about it. He talked about it at dinner tables and golf courses and charity events and anywhere else a person could be made to listen. He talked about what it represented. He talked about legacy. He talked about the responsibility that came with having built something real, something lasting, something that would outlive all of them. He talked about it as if building something was an act of character rather than an act of circumstance, and as if anyone who hadn't built the same kind of thing simply hadn't tried hard enough or come from the right kind of people. I understood within the first 15 minutes of meeting Randall Hale at a family dinner in the Hales' West Hills home that he had already assessed me and found me lacking. I wasn't sure exactly what criteria he'd used. My clothes were good. My manners were correct. I'd asked him a question about the Pearl District development project he was apparently involved with, and his answer had started a discussion that demonstrated I knew more about commercial real estate financing than he'd expected, and for a moment I'd thought that might count for something. It didn't. Some judgments are made before the evidence is considered. Colton's mother, Beverly, was warmer in the way that people can be warm while still being on someone's side. She smiled at me and touched my arm and asked about my family in a way that had a soft pressure underneath it. "Where are you from? What does your father do? Are there people she might know?" I answered simply. My father worked in finance. We were from Sacramento originally, though he'd been based in Portland for the last decade or so. Beverly had smiled at that and then she'd looked past me briefly the way people do when they're calculating. Colton, in those early days, had laughed about his father. He'd called him old school. He'd squeezed my hand at family dinners when Randall said something that landed badly, and he'd said afterward, in the car, that his father was just like that it didn't mean anything, that I shouldn't take it personally. I hadn't taken it personally. I'd taken it carefully, which is different. I'd filed it away and watched and continued to be exactly who I was, and I'd married Colton Hale in a small ceremony on the coast near Cannon Beach, with my father on one side of the aisle and the Hale family filling the other side like a weather system moving in. My father had shaken Randall Hale's hand at the reception and said it was good to meet him, and Randall had said the same, and the two of them had stood there for a moment with the Pacific at their backs, and I'd watched and thought, not yet. Whatever this is, it isn't yet. 5 years. That was how long it took. Aurelius restaurant had been Colton's choice, which I'd thought was a good sign. He'd made the reservations 6 weeks in advance. He'd arranged the guest list himself, 100 couples, which came to 200 guests, plus assorted +1s and colleagues and the Hale family's considerable social contingent, which pushed the final count to somewhere around 400 people seated across the restaurant's main floor and terraced outdoor section, overlooking the river. I'd worn a dress the color of dark amber, not gold, something quieter than gold, and my mother's pearl earrings, and I'd stood in front of the mirror in our bathroom while Colton straightened his jacket behind me, and I'd thought that we looked fine together, that we'd built something that at least looked fine, and sometimes that's as much as you can say about 5 years of anything. The evening started well enough. The food was excellent. The wine was from a Willamette Valley producer that Colton had personally selected, and it was the kind of wine that made the room feel warmer and more generous than it actually was. People toasted us. Colton gave a short speech that was self-deprecating in the practiced way he'd learned from watching his father not be self-deprecating, and I laughed at the right moments and held his hand across the table and told myself this was the life we'd made. Randall Hale was seated at the table to our left, with Beverly and Colton's sister Daphne and her husband, and 2 couples from the Hale family's social circle whose names I'd heard 100 times and still sometimes confused. Randall had been in a particular mood all evening. Expansive, which on him was always slightly aggressive, the way a fire is expansive when it doesn't have a clear boundary. Started small, the way these things always do. A comment about the wine. He'd asked the sommelier something and then turned to our table and said, loudly enough to carry, that it was an interesting selection for an anniversary dinner, that he'd have gone with a different year, that he hoped Colton hadn't paid full price. Colton had laughed. I'd set down my glass. Then, between the second and third course, Randall had looked across at me and said that he'd been hearing some interesting things lately about the neighborhood where I'd grown up. That he'd had a client look at some properties in Sacramento, East Sacramento specifically, and that the values had surprised him, not in a good way. He'd said this pleasantly, with his wine glass in his hand, with a slight smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Not exactly where you'd expect a woman of your ambitions to come from," he said. No offense intended. I let him finish. The table nearest to us had gone slightly quieter. Beverly was looking at her plate. Colton was looking at his father with the expression he always wore when his father was doing something Colton had decided in advance he wouldn't be responsible for. "None taken," I said. My voice stayed even. I picked up my own glass and took a measured sip and set it back down on exactly the same ring it had left on the tablecloth. That should have been enough. In a room with any reasonable weather, that would have been enough. A response that accepted nothing and argued nothing, that simply declined the invitation to escalate. A closed door, clearly closed. Randall Hale was not someone who respected closed doors. The third course arrived, and with it a shift in the room's attention. People turning back to their own tables, conversation resuming, the ambient sound rising again. And Randall, perhaps emboldened by the coverage of noise, leaned forward slightly and said to Colton, in the kind of voice that's designed to be overheard, "I'll say this much, she's got a certain nerve about her, your wife. I suppose that's what you get when a girl grows up without much and decides she's going to reach for something she wasn't born to." I heard the table to our right go quiet. My jaw tightened. I was aware of it, the slight tension at the hinge, the deliberate release. My hands were in my lap and I spread them flat against my thighs, a small grounding pressure, and I looked at a fixed point just past Randall Hale's left shoulder and I did not respond. Not because I had nothing to say. Because the things I had to say were not for this room, not yet, not in front of 400 people who were only here for the anniversary dinner and hadn't signed up for what happened next if I spoke. I looked at Colton. He was looking at his fork. Something moved through my chest then. Not a slow thing, not a patient thing, but I held it the way my father had taught me to hold things that needed to be held. "You don't swallow it," he used to say. "You don't let it out. You keep it right at the surface where you can feel it, and you wait until you're somewhere it can actually do something." I waited. The fourth course. More wine, though I stopped at half a glass, wanting clarity more than warmth. Colton made conversation with the couple on his right, his college friend Dallas Merritt and Dallas's wife, and Randall held court at his own table, his voice rising and falling in that particular register of a man who finds the sound of himself soothing. Beverly touched his arm once. He moved his arm away. By the time the servers began clearing for dessert, I thought the worst of it had passed. I allowed myself to believe that because I needed to, because the alternative was getting up and walking out of my own anniversary dinner, and I hadn't been willing to give Randall Hale the satisfaction of that. I was reaching for my water glass when Randall stood. He didn't tap a fork against crystal. He didn't ask permission. He simply rose, all 6 feet and 2 inches of him, and the room noticed because the room always noticed when Randall Hale stood, and the conversations nearest to us tapered off like flames running out of air. "I want to say something," he announced. Colton's hand moved slightly on the table toward mine. He stopped himself. Randall smiled out at the room, at 400 faces turning toward him, at the white lights on the terrace railing, at the river behind the glass. He said something about what a milestone 5 years was, about the importance of family, about how proud he was of his son for building a life. The words were correct. The architecture of a toast. And then he paused and looked at me, and something shifted behind his eyes. "Presley," he said, and the way he said my name had a weight to it that wasn't affection. "You know, I've always thought you were a spirited girl." That's the word I'd use. Spirited. He let the word sit there. In another life, a different set of circumstances, maybe that's enough. Another pause. He was watching me the way someone watches a door they think they've locked. But a man like my son needs a partner who understands what he's built into. What this family represents. And I have to be honest with you tonight because that's what family is for. I'm not sure you've ever quite understood it. 400 people were absolutely still. My hands were flat in my lap. My shoulders were level. I looked at Randall Hale across the white linen and the half-burned candles and the remnants of 4 courses, and I thought about my father, about the particular way he looked when he was about to say something that mattered, that quiet gathering of himself, and I opened my mouth. "I understand more than you think," I said. Plainly. Steadily. My voice carried. Not raised, just carried, the way a voice does when it's the only thing moving in a still room. Someone near the back of the room exhaled audibly. Randall's expression shifted. Just slightly. Then he smiled, and it was not a good smile. "There she is," he said, to the room as much as to me. "See, this is what I mean. Spirited." He spread his hands. "I'm trying to have a conversation with you, sweetheart, and you want to make a point. Colton, do you see what I mean?" I felt Colton move beside me. I turned my head slightly. I did not see it coming. I want to say I did, that some instinct should have prepared me, some preceding knowledge of who Colton was in the moment when his father required something of him. But I turned my head and I saw his face, the expression on it, which was not his own expression anymore, but something borrowed from the man at the adjacent table, something shaped by 20 years of being Randall Hale's son in rooms full of people. The sound of it was not what I would have expected. It was sharp and flat simultaneously, and it landed against my cheekbone and the corner of my lip, and then I was looking at the river. Not because the impact had turned me. Because my body made its own decision about where to direct my eyes while the rest of me processed what had just happened. The room was perfectly, cavernously silent. And then it wasn't. The sound that came next was not all laughter, I want to be precise about that. It was the complicated sound that crowds make when they are uncertain what they're witnessing, and some of them have chosen the wrong red. Some of it was laughter. Some of it was the sharp intake of breath from people who understood. Some of it was the scrape of chairs from people already moving. But the laughter was there, and it was enough, and it reached me before anything else did. I pressed the back of my hand to the corner of my mouth. My hand came away with the faintest trace of the lipstick I'd applied 3 hours earlier in our bathroom, and something copper-bright underneath it. I counted the pause instead of answering it. Colton said my name. His voice had dropped to something that wasn't remorse. It was closer to alarm, which is a different thing entirely, the alarm of someone who has just understood the specific trouble they're in. He reached for my arm. I stood. I didn't make a speech. I didn't sweep anything off the table. I simply rose, the way my father rose when he was finished with a room, and I reached for my evening bag, and I walked, not quickly, not with any visible urgency, toward the far end of the restaurant where the restrooms were, and where, beyond the corridor, there was a small outdoor landing that looked out over the side of the building away from the river. I pushed through the door. The November air came off the Willamette cold and without courtesy. I stood there for what felt like a long time. The sounds of the restaurant were muffled behind the door. The resumed conversations, the lowered voices, the particular energy of 400 people rearranging the story they just witnessed into something they could carry home. I pressed my fingertips very carefully to my cheekbone. Exhaled. Then I took out my phone. The contact was there at the top of my recent calls, the way it always was, because even now, even after 31 years of building something in the quiet way he built things, Wade Kane answered his daughter's calls within 2 rings, always. I found the name. My thumb hovered. Through the door I could hear Colton's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the particular cadence of his explanations, the rhythm of damage control. I could hear Beverly's voice underneath it, softer, attempting something. I could hear Randall Hale's voice, distinct even through sound-dampening glass, still carrying, still filling the room with the sound of himself. I pressed call. It rang once. Presley. My father's voice, in the specific register he used when he already knew, when some frequency between us had carried the information before the words could. I pressed my free hand flat against the cold metal railing of the landing. Below, a delivery alley. Above, cloud cover over the river, the lights of the Marquam Bridge diffused into something softer than they actually were. "Dad," I said. My voice was steady. Barely, but steady. And that barely was something I kept to myself, held between my palm and the cold railing where no one else could measure it. "Talk to me," he said. "Not what happened or are you all right, just talk to me," which was the thing Wade Kane said when he understood that what was needed wasn't questions but room. Space for whatever needed to come out without having to answer for itself first. So I talked. I stood on the landing above the delivery alley with the November air making something of my hair and my bare arms, and I told him what Randall had said and what Colton had done and the sound the room had made afterward, and I told it in sequence without editorializing, the way my father had taught me to report things, in the order they happened, with the details that mattered, without decorating them in emotion they didn't need because the facts were already enough. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. Not his confusion pause. His thinking pause. I knew the difference. "Where are you right now?" he asked. "Side landing. Off the corridor by the restrooms." "Are you hurt?" My fingers moved, almost involuntarily, back to my cheekbone. The skin there was warm in a way that meant tomorrow there would be color. "Not in a way that needs a doctor," I said. Another pause. "Then, go back inside. Collect your things. Don't explain anything to anyone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Dad, you don't have to." Presley. Just my name. The particular frequency of it when he was not making a request. "Okay," I said. I ended the call. I stayed on the landing for 60 more seconds. I counted them, one by one, not because I was composing myself but because I was deciding something, and decisions made in the right amount of time are sturdier than decisions made in a hurry. At 60 I opened the door and went back inside. The room had reconstituted itself the way rooms do after rupture. A managed normalcy, people in conversation, silverware moving, the ambient hum of 400 people redirecting their attention away from something that had made them uncomfortable. But managed normalcy has a texture, and I felt it as I crossed the floor. The small adjustments in nearby conversations, the glances that turned away a half-second too slowly, the particular care with which certain people found reasons to look at their plates or their wine or the river. Colton was at our table. He stood when he saw me coming, and his face had the open, rearranged look of a man who had spent the last several minutes selecting an expression. "Presley." He moved toward me. His voice was low, aimed at me and not the room. "I need to apologize. I don't know what happened, that was completely." "Not right now," I said. He stopped. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite injury. Something in between, unsure of which to settle on. I reached the table. I picked up my evening bag. I checked, with the peripheral attention I was allowing this, that my phone was inside and that the clasp closed cleanly. It was Daphne who spoke next. Colton's sister had been quiet through dinner in the way that Daphne was often quiet. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she was waiting for the right aperture, the right moment where a comment would land with maximum efficiency. She was 34, 2 years younger than Colton, and she had inherited her father's instinct for pressure points while maintaining her mother's vocabulary of plausible deniability. She was still seated, one hand around her wine glass, and she looked at me with an expression of careful concern that had the same relationship to actual concern that a photograph has to the thing it depicts. "She's always been sensitive," Daphne said. "Not to me. To the table in the general way of someone making an observation. I've noticed it from the beginning. Everything's an issue." She tilted her glass slightly. "Colton, honestly, I said this before you got married. You need someone who understands this family. Who can just be in a room without making it about herself." The two couples from the Hale family's social circle were watching with the careful attention of people who had decided this was not their conflict but were unwilling to miss a word of it. I looked at Daphne. She held my gaze the way she always held it, pleasantly, as though nothing she'd said carried any weight, as though it were all just mild observation made out of mild concern. "Daphne," I said. I didn't add anything to it. I said her name the way you set something on a counter when you're deciding whether to keep it or put it away. She blinked once. Sipped her wine. Then Beverly spoke, across the table, her voice carrying the managed warmth she used when she was trying to cap something before it got larger. "Sweetheart," she said to Daphne, that direction, that soft correction that never quite corrected anything. It meant nothing and was intended to mean nothing except a brief pause in the temperature. Daphne set her glass down and turned her head toward her mother, and in the small space that created, she said, to Beverly but pitched so that it carried, "I'm not saying anything that isn't true. If Colton had married someone who actually understood what this family is, tonight wouldn't have happened." The two social circle couples had gone very still. Beverly said, "Daphne." "I'm just being honest," Daphne said. "That's what this family does, isn't it? We're honest." She glanced at me, brief, calibrated, the glance of someone who believes they are delivering clarity rather than cruelty. She spoke back to Dad in front of 400 people. Colton reacted. "That's what happened. That's all that happened. That's all that happened." I looked at Daphne for a long moment. I kept my face level. My hands were at my sides and I was aware of both of them, the steadiness of them, and I thought about all the things I could have said in that restaurant in front of 400 people on the night of my anniversary, and I thought about the particular cost of not saying them, and I thought about my father's voice saying I'll be there in 20 minutes, and I decided that this too was not the room. "Good night," I said. To the table generally. Not to Daphne specifically. Not to Colton, not to Beverly, not to the watching social circle. To the table as a whole, as a thing I was finished with. I walked toward the front of the restaurant without looking back. The coat check was in a small alcove near the restaurant's entrance, attended by a young woman who had the slightly shell-shocked expression of someone who had been running coats all evening and had heard more than she'd expected to hear. She found my ticket and retrieved the coat, a long charcoal wool one, and I was reaching to take it from her when I heard Colton Hale's voice from around the corner of the alcove, in the area near the host's stand. He wasn't talking to me. He was on his phone, and his voice had dropped from the public register he'd used at the table to the lower, transactional register of a man conducting real business. I should have kept moving. I should have put on my coat and walked to the exit and let my father handle whatever was being handled. Instead, I stood very still and I listened. "Not a problem," Randall was saying. "I told you it's not a problem. The Carver Street parcels, the documentation, we just need to move the timeline up. Before anyone starts asking questions about the assessment." A pause. "No, I'm aware. I'm aware of what Delgado filed. That's exactly why we need to move it." Another pause, shorter. "Get me the revised appraisal by Thursday. I don't care how. Get it to me." He ended the call. I finished putting on my coat. My hands were unhurried. I thanked the coat check attendant. She met my eyes for just a moment longer than a transaction required, the look of someone who has witnessed something and is uncertain what to do with having witnessed it, and I walked to the exit and out into the night where the river was still black and the lights of the bridge were still diffused behind cloud cover. My father arrived in 19 minutes. I was standing outside on the river-facing terrace when the car pulled up, a dark, unremarkable sedan that he had driven for 6 years because Wade Kane had long ago stopped feeling any need to broadcast himself through what he drove. He got out without hurrying. He was 63 years old, and he moved like a man of 63 who had spent those years doing exactly what he intended to do, which gave him a quality of self-possession that I had spent my entire life trying to understand the mechanics of. He came up the terrace steps and he looked at my face. Not at the mark specifically, though I saw his eyes go there and register it and file it, and then he opened his arms, and I went into them the way I'd been going into them since I was 6 years old and the world had briefly exceeded my capacity. He held on. He didn't say anything. He smelled like the wool of his overcoat and the cedar closet where he kept it, and underneath that, faintly, the particular paper and ink smell that I'd always associated with his home office in the house on Sutter Street where I'd grown up. That smell caught me somewhere below the sternum. I held on for a moment longer than I meant to. Then I stepped back. My voice was even when I spoke. "He's still inside." "I know," my father said. He looked at the restaurant entrance. His expression was not angry in any visible way. It was the expression of someone who has already done the calculation and has moved on to logistics. "You don't have to go back in." "I know I don't," I said. We stood there for a moment, the two of us, with the river at our backs. "There are things," he said carefully, "that I should have told Colton a long time ago. That I chose not to, because they weren't the point and I didn't want them to be." He paused. "I'm going to go inside." I looked at him. "Dad." "Not tonight," he said. "Not the way you're worried about." He looked at me with that particular steadiness that had always been his primary characteristic, the thing that was so consistent it had become almost invisible to me, like wallpaper you stop seeing because it's always been there. "Tonight I'm just going to have a conversation with your husband." He touched my shoulder once, briefly, and then he went up the steps and into Aurelius, and I turned and looked at the river and I waited. What I thought about, standing there, was a drawer. Specifically, the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in my father's home office, the one that was always locked, that I had grown up understanding was locked not because it contained anything shameful but because it contained things that were too important to be left accessible to accident. My father had a precise relationship with importance. Important things were protected. Unimportant things were left on the counter. The first time he'd shown me what was in that drawer, I was 22, just graduated from the University of Oregon, home for the summer before I'd figured out what came next. He'd unlocked it on a Tuesday afternoon in July, matter-of-factly, the way he did most things, and he'd reached in and pulled out a folder. A thick one, manila, the tabs labeled in his handwriting in the fine-point pen he'd used since before I was born. I'd sat in the chair across from his desk while he laid the folder on the blotter between us and opened it. "This is the company," he'd said. Simple as that. I'd looked at the papers. The original articles of incorporation, filed in Oregon in 1993. The operating agreement. The first capital account statement, a number that, by the time he was showing me this, had grown to something I didn't have a reference point for. His signature on everything, his and no one else's, because Kane Capital Partners had always been structured as a sole member entity. No partners, despite the name, which had been his small, private joke since the beginning. I reached across the desk, and he let me take the folder. I turned the pages carefully, the way he'd taught me to handle documents, and I understood for the first time. Not the money, not the specific figure of it, but the scope. The 31 years of discipline and decision and reinvestment and quiet, and the structure he'd built around it to make sure it endured. "Why are you showing me this now?" I'd asked. He'd taken the folder back, placed it in the drawer, and locked it again before answering. "Because you're going to go out into the world and people are going to form impressions of you," he said. "And some of those impressions will be wrong. And I want you to know, when that happens, that the wrong impression is their problem to eventually correct, not yours to immediately fix." I hadn't fully understood it then. I'd understood the words. The meaning had needed years to properly settle. Standing on the terrace outside Aurelius at 11:15 on the night of my 5th wedding anniversary, with my cheekbone warm and the river black in the November dark, I understood it completely. My father was inside for 42 minutes. I know because I watched the time, not obsessively, but with the steady attention of someone who needs something concrete to track when everything else is in motion. At 12 minutes, I saw Daphne and her husband leave through the front entrance. Daphne's face as she passed me on the terrace had the compressed quality of someone who had been in a room where something unexpected had occurred and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. She looked at me briefly. She didn't say anything. They got into their car. At 23 minutes, Beverly came out. She stopped when she saw me, and her face moved through several expressions before landing on one that was mostly sorrow and partly something more complicated, the expression of a woman who had spent many years understanding exactly what her husband was and had made her arrangements with that understanding, and was now standing on the edge of those arrangements requiring a renegotiation she hadn't planned for. "Presley," she said. Her voice was quiet. It had lost the managed warmth of earlier in the evening. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, from me specifically, I'm sorry." I looked at her carefully. "I know you are, Beverly," I said. She nodded once, the kind of nod that doesn't ask for more, and then she walked to where her car was waiting, and she got in, and it pulled away, and the terrace was quiet again except for the river. At 38 minutes, Colton came out. He'd been crying. I could see it in the redness at the corners of his eyes, in the way he was holding his face slightly too, still the way people do when they've been crying and have tried to stop and are not confident they have actually stopped. He came to where I was standing and he put his hands in his pockets and he looked at me and then at the river and then at me again. "Your father," he started. Then stopped. Tried again. I didn't, Presley, I had no idea. About any of it. He never told me. I watched him. I didn't fill the silence. "The company," he said. The words sat strangely in his mouth, like something he'd been handed that he wasn't sure how to hold. How much of it? He never said anything, you never said anything, I just assumed. He broke off, pressed his mouth closed, opened it again. Why didn't you tell me? Would it have changed anything? I asked. My voice was even. I was genuinely curious, not rhetorically, not cruelly. I wanted to know if he had an honest answer. He looked at me for a long moment. The honesty of what he was about to say moved across his face before the words came. I don't know, he said. And that was the truest thing he'd said to me all evening. I nodded. That's the right answer, I said. He reached for my hand. I let him take it briefly and then I stepped back. I need to think, I said. Presley. Colton. My voice stayed quiet. Steady. Not hard, I wasn't giving him hardness because that wasn't what this was. I need to think. That's all I'm saying. Give me that. He stood there with his hands back in his pockets and his eyes too bright and the November wind moving between us, and he nodded. I went inside to retrieve my coat, which I'd set over a chair rather than checking it, and when I came back out my father was coming down the front steps. We didn't speak on the terrace. We walked to the car together, in the particular silence of two people who are in agreement about what comes next and don't need to say it out loud. He unlocked the car. He opened the passenger door and waited while I got in, and then he came around and settled into the driver's seat and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel without starting the engine. The parking structure above us was the ugly sodium-lit non-place that parking structures always were, and neither of us commented on it. Carver Street, I said. He turned his head. Looked at me. I heard him, I said. At the coat check. On his phone. Something moved through his face, brief, precise. Not surprise. The specific expression of a man whose timeline has just been handed a new variable and who is already accounting for it. How much did you hear? The Carver Street parcels. Moving the documentation timeline. Someone named Delgado filing something. A revised appraisal by Thursday. I paused. Enough. He was quiet for a moment. The November cold had found the car already, working in through the seams. He didn't start the engine. There are things about Randall Hale's portfolio, he said, that I've known about for a while. That I've been watching. How long? I asked. 14 months, he said. He said it without deflection, without preamble. The way he said things that he'd been waiting to say, things that had been taking up a specific amount of space in a specific part of his attention and were now being released into the room between us. Since the first assessment crossed my desk through a client who'd looked at the Carver Street parcel as an acquisition and couldn't reconcile the numbers. The assessed value was less than half what any legitimate independent evaluation would have supported. The gap was too large to be incompetence. It was structured. I looked at my father's profile in the flat, practical light from the parking structure above us. 63 years old, and in that light he looked it. Not old, but exactly his age, the age of someone who had been paying close attention for a very long time. What's on Carver Street? I asked. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his coat. I watched his hand go in. I watched it come out. What he held was a single piece of paper, folded in thirds, the crease worn at the edges in the way that paper wears when it's been folded and unfolded a number of times, when someone has returned to it repeatedly, checking a thing they already know but keep needing to confirm. He held it without opening it, balanced at the ends between two fingers, looking at it. I was going to wait, he said. I had a timeline. I was being careful about it. His thumb moved along the worn edge of the fold. Tonight changes the timeline. What's on that paper? I asked. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. This, he said, is the beginning of what Randall Hale doesn't know I know. He held it out to me. I reached for it. My fingers closed on the edge, and he released it, and I held the worn rectangle in my lap and looked at it for a moment before I opened it. The paper unfolded in 3 panels. My father reached up and clicked on the car's interior light without being asked, understanding that I needed to see. And in that flat, practical light I looked at what he'd been carrying in the breast pocket of his coat. It was a property assessment, printed on official letterhead from a firm called Meridian Valuation Services, dated 14 months prior, for a parcel on Carver Street in Portland's Central East Side, a former light industrial block that had been rezoned for mixed-use development 2 years before that. The assessed value was listed at $4.2 million. I read the whole page. The language was technical and precise in the way that real estate assessment language always is. Specific square footage, zoning classifications, comparable sales methodology, the name of the appraiser, and their licensing number. It had the particular authority of a document that has been produced by someone who knows how to make a document look authoritative. I read it slowly. Underneath the printed text, in my father's handwriting, in the fine point pen, in the careful block letters he used when he wanted something to be readable without question, was a single line: Independent Comp, $9.1 million. I looked at the number. Then at the assessment. Then at the number again. He had it appraised at less than half its actual value, I said. Appraised at less than half, my father said, and then used that appraisal to secure financing at terms a legitimate assessment wouldn't have supported. He wasn't looking at the paper. He'd clearly looked at it enough times that looking at it again would have given him nothing new. The lender was a regional bank, First Cascade, with a board member who does a great deal of business with Randall's firm. His name is Dennis Achterberg. The loan closed 11 months ago, on terms that required the Carver Street parcel to be assessed at a value it has never legitimately held. The loan amount, and the interest rate, and the collateral structure, all of it was predicated on a number that Randall and his appraiser manufactured. I refolded the paper along its worn creases. My hands were precise about it, matching the existing folds, not creating new ones. This is fraud, I said. This is the part of the fraud I can demonstrate, he said. There's more. I held the folded paper in my lap. Outside the parking structure, through the concrete geometry of the exit ramp, the night was still the same November night it had been. The same cloud cover, the same diffused bridge lights, the same river. From inside the car it was remote, framed like a photograph of a night rather than the night itself. How many properties? I asked. 4, he said. The Carver Street parcel is one of at least 4 using the same structure. Same lender. Same gap between the assessed value and what any independent evaluation would have found. The man Randall was talking to on the phone tonight, Delgado, filed a zoning complaint 6 weeks ago on a different property in the same portfolio. A parcel on Burnside Avenue. Randall's been applying pressure to have the complaint dismissed before it triggers a formal review that would bring attention to the valuation methodology. I turned the folded paper over once in my hands, then set it on my knee. You said 14 months, I said. You've had this for 14 months. Yes. While I was married to his son. Yes. The word landed without apology or decoration, the same way he'd been saying true things my entire life. He met my eyes in the dim light and held them. Did you bring it to someone? I asked. I brought it to someone I trust at the state attorney's office, he said. Informally, first, in the way that you bring something to someone when you're not yet certain you have enough to formally bring it, when you're still in the early construction of understanding what you have. Then less informally, as the picture got clearer. As I found the second property, and then the third, and then the connection to Achterberg at the bank became demonstrable rather than speculative. I looked at my father. You've been working with the attorney's office for 14 months, I said. While I was having Sunday dinners in that house. Yes. You could have told me. I could have, he agreed. He didn't move away from it, didn't soften it or offer a competing version. I chose not to. I didn't want it to change how you moved through your life until there was something concrete enough to move on. I was protecting the investigation and I was protecting you, and I'll accept whatever you think about that decision. I looked at him for a long moment. The cold had finished finding the car, working into the floor and the seats, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. I think, I said slowly, that you were right and I wish you'd trusted me with it sooner, and I'm going to hold both of those things at the same time. Something moved through his face that might have been the closest he came to relief. That's fair, he said. He started the engine. The heat came on. I held the folded Carver Street assessment and looked at the sodium yellow light above the windshield and thought about the last 14 months. The dinners, the Sunday afternoons at the Hale house in West Hills, Randall's voice carrying across every room he'd ever occupied, the way he talked about legacy and what he'd built, and underneath all of it, in a breast pocket or a locked drawer or a file that was growing steadily heavier, a document with a number on it that told a different story. About what Randall Hale had built and how. What happens now? I asked. Now, my father said, putting the car in reverse, we go home, and in the morning there are some calls that need to be made. He drove us to Sacramento without my suggesting it because that was where the important things were kept. I didn't sleep. Not with any real intention. I lay in the guest room of my father's house on Sutter Street, and I listened to the house settle around me. The particular vocabulary of old wood and plaster, the sound of the magnolia branch outside the east window moving against the glass in the November wind, a sound I'd been hearing since childhood, since before I'd had a name for what the tree was or why my mother collected its petals in a bowl. My cheekbone had developed a bruise by midnight. I'd looked at it in the bathroom mirror with the same careful attention I gave things I needed to understand completely. A stripe of color from below the eye to the upper edge of the cheekbone, muted now, but tomorrow it would be distinct. I pressed it once, gently. Exhaled. Then I turned off the light. In the dark I thought about Colton's voice in the parking lot. I had no idea. About any of it. He never told me. The genuine shock in it, which I believed. I'd been married to him for 5 years and I knew the difference between his performed emotions and his real ones, and the shock had been real. Colton had not known. Which meant Colton had slapped me not to protect a secret but to manage a room. Had slapped me because his father's expression in that moment had required it, because 20 years of being Randall Hale's son had built in him a particular reflexive response to his father's public authority, and he hadn't stopped to think because that reflex doesn't think. That understanding made it worse and better simultaneously, in a ratio I couldn't yet calculate. At 3 a.m, I stopped trying to sleep and went downstairs and made tea and sat at the kitchen table where I'd done homework for 18 years, and I thought about what my father had said about the morning and the calls that needed to be made. I thought about Daphne's voice in the restaurant. She's always been sensitive, and the particular ease with which she delivered it, the ease of someone who has never once been required to consider that she might be wrong. I thought about the coat check attendant, who had met my eyes for a moment longer than a transaction required. I thought about Colton's hands in his pockets on the terrace, his eyes too bright, the November wind between us. I thought about the folded paper on my bedside table upstairs, the Carver Street assessment with my father's handwriting underneath it, the $9.1 million in block letters, and I thought about what it meant that Randall Hale had been sitting at anniversary dinners and holiday tables and Sunday lunches for 14 months while that document existed in a locked drawer 30 minutes from his office. He had built something, Randall Hale. He'd said so, and in a particular sense he was right. But what he'd built and what he claimed to have built were two different structures, and for 14 months my father had been quietly measuring the gap between them. Randall called at 9:47 the next morning. I was in my father's study when it happened, not by coincidence. My father had made 2 calls already, brief ones, with the door open, which meant he intended me to hear the shape of them without necessarily every word. I'd gathered from the shape that the timeline was being moved, that certain conversations that had been scheduled for later were being scheduled for sooner, and that at least one person on the other end of those calls had said something that made my father nod once with the expression of a man whose estimation of a situation has been confirmed. When Randall's name appeared on my phone screen, I took 3 seconds before I answered. "Presley," he said. His voice was in a register I hadn't heard from him before. Not his public register, not his table-holding court register. Tighter. More controlled. The register of a man who is accustomed to running situations and has just been informed that a situation is no longer entirely his to run. "Randall," I said. "I think we should talk. In person. There's clearly been," he paused, reaching for the right word, "a misunderstanding. About last night, about a number of things, and I'd rather address it directly than let it become something it doesn't need to become." "All right," I said. He was quiet for a half-second, apparently having expected more resistance. "I can come to wherever you are." Colton told me you're not at the house. I'll come to you, I said. This afternoon. 2 o'clock. Another brief recalculation on his end. Fine, he said. The office. I understood the choice. The office rather than the house gave him a power position, a home terrain, the authority of the built environment around him. 2 o'clock, I confirmed. My father was in the doorway of the study when I lowered the phone. He'd heard enough. I'm coming with you, he said. I know, I said. The Hale group occupied the top 2 floors of a building in the Pearl District, the kind of address that was chosen precisely because it communicated what it communicated, the exposed brick and the steel frame windows and the view of the West Hills that Randall had probably described as inspiring in more than one interview. The receptionist on the upper floor was young and polished, and her expression when she saw us did something complicated before it resolved into professional neutrality. Randall met us in the conference room, not his private office, which told me he'd made a choice about staging. The conference room had a long table and a view, and the particular impersonality of a room designed for transactions rather than conversations. Colton was there, which I hadn't expected. He was standing near the window, and he looked at me when I came in with an expression I'd seen only a few times before, stripped of its management, genuinely uncertain. Randall stood at the head of the table. He looked at my father. My father looked back at him. Something passed between them in that look, not hostility, not warmth. Recognition. The specific recognition of 2 men who had been in the same territory without ever having formally occupied the same room, and who were now doing so for the first time. Wade, Randall said. Randall, my father said. Then Randall looked at my face, at the bruise, which was livid by afternoon, precisely what I'd predicted in the bathroom mirror, and his expression moved through something that might have been discomfort before it moved to rearrangement. Presley, he said, shifting to me. I want to start by saying that what happened last night was not what I intended. I was speaking frankly, as I always do, and I think the situation escalated beyond what any of us anticipated. I sat down at the table, not at the far end, midway, equidistant from the head and the foot. My father sat beside me. Colton remained at the window. Go on, I said. Randall sat down. He set his hands on the table, flat, the gesture of a man demonstrating openness. I want to be honest with you both. I've had some concerns about this marriage from the beginning. Not personal concerns, Presley, not about you as a person, but concerns about fit. About what Colton needs and what this family needs, and whether the foundation was built on a full understanding of what both parties were bringing to it. By which you mean, I said, you didn't know what I was bringing to it financially, and now you do, and you're adjusting your position. Randall's jaw moved. That's a reductive way to characterize. Is it inaccurate? I asked. He held my gaze. He was very good at holding gazes. It was one of his primary instruments, the sustained eye contact of a man who'd learned that most people looked away first. I didn't look away. I think, he said carefully, that there was a misalignment of information. On both sides. There was no misalignment on my side, I said. I knew exactly what your family had. I chose not to make what my family had the first thing I put on the table, because it shouldn't have been relevant to whether or not your son and I were good for each other. It became relevant because you made it relevant. Presley. Randall's voice dropped slightly, adopting the register of patient instruction, the tone of a man explaining something to someone who hasn't yet understood the room they're in. I understand you're upset about last night. I understand Colton behaved in a way that... I'm not discussing last night right now, I said. Last night is documented. I have photographs of my face from this morning taken at 7:42, time-stamped in adequate light. That's a separate matter with its own process. I paused. Right now I'm discussing what you just said, about fit, about what this family needs, about the foundation of this marriage. Randall looked at me. He looked at my father. My father was looking at the view of the West Hills with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he planned to arrive and is simply waiting for the sequence to proceed. You built a picture of me, I said. You built it before I sat down at your dinner table the first time, and you added to it every time I was in a room you were in, and you never once revised it based on anything I actually did, because revising it would have required you to admit the original picture was wrong. And you don't do that. That's not. Let me finish, I said. My voice was even. Conversational, almost. You decided I came from nothing. You decided I had ambitions above my station, which is a phrase that means something very specific and that you've essentially said to me directly on 2 separate occasions. You decided that Colton needed someone who, what did you say last night? Who understands what he's built into. What this family represents. I paused. You've been performing that picture of me in front of your family, your social circle, and 400 people at a restaurant for 5 years. Presley. His voice had moved now to something flatter and less patient. I think you need to consider that you're in a room making accusations that. I haven't made any accusations, I said. I've described what happened. Those are different things. Colton, near the window, made a sound, not quite a word. He caught himself and was quiet again. Randall straightened slightly. He looked at my father. Wade. I don't know what role you've decided to play in this, but this is a conversation between my son and his wife, and I'd ask you to. Mr. Kane is here at my invitation, I said. As is his right. Randall looked at me. Something shifted in his expression. The early stages of a recalibration, the beginning of the understanding that this room was not running on the architecture he'd arrived with. I've tried to approach this reasonably, he said. I came here today prepared to have a genuine conversation about what happened and how we move forward as a family. If you want to litigate every dinner conversation from the last 5 years, we can do that, but I don't think that serves anyone. It serves the truth, I said. Which I've noticed you're not comfortable with when it isn't the version you've constructed. His jaw set. I've been building things in this city for 30 years. Real things. And I've earned the right to have certain expectations about the people who come into my family's life, and I make no apology for that. What you've built, I said, and I said it simply, without theatrics, the way you state a fact in a room where you are the only person who knows the full extent of it, is something I'd like to talk about. The room changed. I let the sentence sit. I watched Randall process it. The slight change in how he was holding himself, the particular stillness that settled over him the way stillness settles over an animal that has just noticed a shift in the weather. Carver Street, I said. His hands, still flat on the table, became very slightly less flat. I beg your pardon? He said. Carver Street, I said. The Meridian valuation. The loan from First Cascade Bank. The $4.2 million assessment on a parcel your own broker had comped at 9.1. Colton had turned completely from the window. My father, beside me, reached into the inside breast pocket of his jacket, the same unhurried motion I'd watched in the car the night before, and this time what he took out was not the single worn page but a folder. A thin one, not the manila folder from the locked drawer, something more recent, assembled for this room for this afternoon. He set it on the conference table, aligned with the edge, and opened it with the particular deliberateness of a man who has done this before and understands the effect of doing it without rushing. He took out the first page and laid it flat on the table between us and Randall. A copy of the Meridian valuation assessment, clean, unfolded, the letterhead clear. You've seen this before, my father said. It was not a question. Then he reached into the folder again and took out a second page. A single sheet, a summary document in his firm's format, 4 rows, for properties, each with 2 numbers side by side. The assessed value and the independent evaluation. 4 times, the gap was more than double. He laid that flat beside the first page. Randall looked at the 2 documents on the table. He looked at them the way you look at something you have been hoping would not appear in any room you were sitting in. Where did you get that? Randall said. His voice had changed, not lost its control, not yet, but the control was effortful now in a way it hadn't been before, like a weight being held at arm's length instead of set down. That's proprietary business information, and I don't know what you think you. The appraiser on 2 of the 4 properties has already been interviewed, my father said. His voice was quiet. Conversational. He's been cooperative. Randall stood up. This is not your business, he said, and his voice had heat in it now. Not the performed heat of his anniversary dinner pronouncements, but something more essential, the heat of a man who has just seen the walls of a room begin to move. Whatever you think you have, wherever you got it, this is a private business matter and you have no standing here. Neither of you. His eyes moved to me. You came into this family with nothing declared, nothing on the table, playing some kind of… Randall. My father's voice was even. Just the name. Randall stopped. My father looked at him with a patience that was not passive. It was the patience of someone who has already won and is simply managing the sequence of that winning. Sit down, he said. Randall did not sit down. But he stopped speaking, which was the relevant thing. The Attorney General's office has had the Carver Street file for 9 days, my father said. They have the Meridian assessment, the first Cascade loan documents, the independent appraisals on all 4 properties, and the email correspondence between your office and the board member at the bank who approved the terms. You're welcome to call your attorney. That would actually be my recommendation. Colton said, Dad. Be quiet, Colton, Randall said. Sharply. Then he looked at my father, and then at me, and his face moved through several things, none of them small. And when it settled on a version of himself I hadn't seen before, which was the version stripped of its audience. Without the room of 400 people, without the board members and the social circle and the managed perception, Randall Hale was a man of 61 who was looking at the structure of a very long effort beginning to fail. What do you want? He said. What happens inside a family, I said, is a private matter. His eyes came to me. I let the sentence sit. I watched him understand that I was giving it back to him. His own architecture, his own construction, returned without alteration, still carrying exactly the weight he'd given it in this room 30 minutes ago. You brought that here, I said. Those words. I want to make sure you remember them. What does that mean? He said. His voice was lower now. Controlled again, but differently, the control of someone managing a threat rather than an audience. It means this conversation isn't finished, I said. It means there are things that still need to happen, and how they happen will depend on choices that you and Colton make in the next several days. I paused. And it means that I'm going to remember exactly what you said in this room, and you should count on that. Randall looked at me for a long moment. The West Hills were impassive behind him in the window. Colton was very still near the glass. You have no idea, Randall said, and his voice had dropped to something almost private, almost meant only for me, the voice of a man who has decided to show her what's actually underneath the performance. What you're starting, what this family is capable of. You walked into something you don't fully understand, and you're standing there acting like you have all of it when you have a fraction. A fraction. He let that land. You want to talk about documents? We'll talk about documents. You want to talk about what Wade Kane has been doing while he was building his little case? He glanced at my father, and the glance had teeth in it. Because there are 2 sides to every ledger, sweetheart, and you haven't seen the other one yet. I looked at him. My father, beside me, had gone very still in the way he went still when something had just confirmed something he'd expected. I looked at Randall Hale across the conference table with its view of the hills and the afternoon light coming in flat and gray through the steel frame windows, and I said nothing. I counted the pause instead of answering it. What happens inside a family? Randall said again, the 3rd time, deliberate now, a shape he was building, a door he believed he was closing, is handled by the family. And then he looked directly at me, and he said the thing that was the thing, the sentence underneath all the other sentences, stripped of the public voice and the table holding and the anniversary dinner pronouncements, stripped down to what Randall Hale actually believed about the room he was standing in and the people he was standing with. You will never be the most important person at any table I sit at. Not today. Not ever. I looked at Randall Hale across the conference table, and I let his sentence exist in the room for exactly as long as it needed to. Long enough that everyone present understood I was choosing my response rather than reacting to his provocation, and then I said, I know. 2 words. Plain. Set down without ceremony. He blinked. I know that's what you believe, I said. I've known it since the first dinner at your house in West Hills. You decided what I was before I sat down, and nothing I did in 5 years changed that assessment because you weren't actually looking at me. You were looking at what you'd already decided. I paused. That's not my problem to solve. It turns out it's yours. Randall opened his mouth. My father said, before this continues, there's someone who'd like to join us. Randall looked at him. I beg your pardon? My father reached into the inside breast pocket of his jacket, the same pocket, the same unhurried motion, and this time what he took out was his phone. He set it on the conference table, screen up, and slid it a few inches toward the center. I took the liberty, he said, of asking her to wait until we'd had a chance to speak directly. I thought you deserved that courtesy. He tapped the screen twice. The speakerphone opened. A voice came through, female, measured, with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to speaking in rooms where what she said had legal weight. Mr. Hale, the voice said. This is Margaret Osei. I'm a senior investigator with the Oregon Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Division. Thank you for making yourself available this afternoon. The room was absolutely still. Colton, near the window, had both hands pressed flat against the glass behind him as though the building had tilted. Randall's face did not collapse, he was too practiced for collapse. But it reorganized, rapidly and visibly, into something I hadn't seen on it before. The specific expression of a man who has just understood that the room he believed he was running has a different architect. This is not, he stopped. Looked at my father. You don't have the authority to. Mr. Hale, Margaret Osei said calmly, no one here is placing you under any legal obligation at this moment. This is a preliminary conversation. You're, of course, welcome to have your attorney present. In fact, I'd recommend it. What I'd like to do is make sure you understand the scope of what the division has reviewed, so that when your attorney does advise you, they have the full picture to work from. Randall put both hands on the conference table. He leaned forward slightly, the way he leaned when he was about to reassert the direction of something. Whatever Wade Kane has given you, whatever he's told you, he has a personal interest in this situation that you should be aware of. We're aware of Mr. Kane's role, she said. We've been aware of it for 9 days. His cooperation has been extensive and documented. What we'd like to discuss with you, Mr. Hale, is the Carver Street parcel, the Burnside Avenue acquisition, and the 2 Lloyd District properties, all 4 of which share an appraisal methodology that our forensic accountant has now formally characterized as fraudulent. A pause, brief and precise. We also want to discuss the relationship between your firm and Mr. Dennis Achterberg at First Cascade Bank, given that Mr. Achterberg entered into a cooperation agreement with this office 6 days ago. The name landed in the room like something thrown. Randall straightened. His jaw was set. He looked at my father with an expression that had moved past the reorganization stage and arrived somewhere older and colder, the expression of a man who is calculating not whether he's in trouble but how much. I have nothing further to say, Randall said, without my attorney. Of course, Margaret Osei said. We'll be in touch with his office directly. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hale. A beat. And Presley, thank you for making this meeting possible. My father reached across and ended the call. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not dramatic. That was the thing about real consequence, it rarely looked like consequence in the moment. It looked like a man straightening his jacket and telling his son they were leaving and picking up his phone from where it rested on the table in front of him. It looked like ordinary motion, ordinary exits, the unremarkable physical vocabulary of people removing themselves from a room. Colton looked at me before he followed his father. There was a question in his face, not a spoken one, something more foundational than a question, something closer to, who did I actually marry, and is the answer to that something I get to know now or later or never? I held his gaze for a moment and I didn't answer the unspoken thing because this wasn't the moment for it, and I also wasn't sure yet what the answer was. Then he followed his father out of the conference room, and the door closed, and my father and I were alone with the view of the West Hills and the flat gray afternoon light coming in through the steel frame windows. My father exhaled. It was a small sound, almost nothing. The exhale of a man who has been holding a careful breath for 14 months and has just been given permission to release it. I heard it the way I heard things in that room, which was completely without any noise behind it. Achterberg cooperated, I said. 6 days ago. I didn't know until this morning. That was one of the calls. He picked up his phone and put it back in his pocket. He picked up the 2 documents from the table, the Meridian assessment and the 4-property summary sheet, and returned them to the thin folder, closed it, and held it in one hand without making any particular movement toward leaving. He was giving me a moment to be in the room. He had always understood when I needed a moment to be in a room. He's agreed to testify to the loan terms on all 4 properties. The fraudulent appraisals were his mechanism as much as Randall's. He approved financing he knew was based on false valuations because Randall's firm sent him business, significant business, over 11 years. I sat with that for a moment. 11 years. A sustained structure, maintained across more than a decade, between 2 men who had between them managed to make something that was straightforwardly criminal look like ordinary commerce. 11 years of Randall Hale at dinner tables talking about legacy and what he'd built and the responsibility of having built something real, and underneath that, running parallel to it the entire time, the other structure. The one he didn't describe at dinner tables. Randall mentioned the other side of the ledger, I said. He was implying something about you. My father nodded. He'd been expecting this. Yes. He'll try to complicate the picture. Find something in my history or my firm's history that he can use to muddy the water. His attorney will look. He looked at me steadily. There's nothing there, Presley. I want you to hear that from me directly. I know, I said. And I did know, not blindly, not because he was my father, but because I knew how Wade Kane operated and I knew what he kept in that locked drawer and I had spent 32 years watching him move through the world, and the idea of something hidden in his ledger that hadn't already been disclosed and managed was not a real idea. It was the idea of a man who was running out of architecture and had decided that implication was the last room available to him. I stood. My coat was on the chair where I'd draped it when we arrived, and I reached for it and pulled it on, and in the motion of doing something ordinary, the familiar small weight of the coat, the particular scratch of the wool at my wrist, I felt the afternoon settle into something that had a shape. Not resolution. Not yet. But the beginning of a shape. What's next? I asked. He stood as well. He picked up the thin folder. Now we go back to the house, he said. Because there are 2 more things I need to show you, and they're there. The locked drawer. He opened it when we got home, with the same small key on the same keyring he'd carried since before I could remember. A plain brass ring with 4 keys, no ornament, no distinguishing marks. The filing cabinet was in the corner of the study where it had always been, and the bottom drawer opened with the particular sound of something that is used carefully and maintained well. Not the grinding protest of a neglected mechanism, but the clean, precise movement of something that has been opened and closed the right number of times over the right number of years. He reached in. He took out the manila folder I remembered from a decade ago. Thicker now, substantially thicker, the tab relabeled in the same fine-point handwriting but with a new date beside the label, 2 months prior. He set it on the desk blotter with both hands, the weight of it visible in how he set it down, and opened it. But he didn't start with the top document. He moved through the first several pages with the practiced attention of someone navigating a document they know completely, his fingers moving through the tabs without hesitation, and he stopped at a page toward the back third of the folder and separated it from the rest, and he picked it up and held it for a moment before he handed it to me. I took it. It was a letter, printed on the stationery of a Portland law firm, Aldrich Voss and Partners, an address in the South Park blocks, dated 8 months prior. The letterhead was clean and conservative, the kind of design that communicates seriousness without ostentation, which is the design choice of firms that have been in business long enough to know that ostentation is what you do before you've earned the right to be quiet about it. I unfolded the second page, which was attached, and I read it slowly. It was a formal notification letter addressed to Randall Hale. The language was precise in the way that legal language is precise when it has been drafted by someone who understands that every word will eventually be read in a different room than the one it was written in, possibly by a judge, possibly by a jury, possibly by a journalist or an investigator or an attorney who will have reasons of their own for parsing it carefully. It informed Randall Hale that Kane Capital Partners had identified potential fraud in the appraisal and financing of 4 Portland-area commercial properties, that the matter had been referred to the Oregon Department of Justice for review, and that Mr. Hale was advised to seek legal counsel immediately. It listed the 4 properties by address. It was signed by my father's attorney. I looked up at my father. "You sent this?" "My attorney sent it on my behalf," he said. 8 months ago. Registered mail, confirmation of receipt on file. I looked back at the letter. I read it again, more slowly this time, not for the content. I'd understood the content on the first pass, but for the particular experience of reading something in my father's study in Sacramento that had been sitting in Randall Hale's possession for 8 months. That had been in his office or his house or wherever he kept the things he was most afraid of for 8 months. While I was still going to Sunday dinners at that house. While I was still sitting at that table. "He received this 8 months ago," I said. "While I was still married to his son. While I was still going to those dinners." "Yes." I held the letter and thought about 8 months of Sunday dinners with the knowledge of that letter in the room, in Randall's chest, underneath every performance of the table-holding patriarch. I thought about the particular quality of his voice during those 8 months. Had it changed? Had there been moments where the performance slipped and I'd noticed something underneath it without understanding what it was? I went back through my memory of those 8 months, Sunday by Sunday, the meals and the conversations and the particular way Randall held court, and I could not find the seam. He had maintained it completely. Whatever fear or calculation was running underneath, he had not let it surface into the room. That was its own kind of information about who he was. "He never said a word to Colton," I said. "Not a word," my father confirmed. "Which tells you something about what Colton is to him. Not a partner, not a confidant. An asset to be managed. Someone whose ignorance was useful." I laid the letter flat on the desk beside the open folder. Smoothed it once with the side of my hand, straightening the fold creases, the automatic gesture of someone who handles documents with respect regardless of what's in them. "You said there were 2 more things," I said. He reached into the drawer again. This time what he retrieved was not a folder and not a single page. It was an envelope, letter-sized, cream-colored, with my name on the front in his handwriting. Not typed. Handwritten in the fine-point pen in the careful block letters, Presley, and underneath it, in smaller letters, "In the event this becomes necessary." I looked at it. The cream paper had the slight texture of good stationery, the kind that costs enough that you notice it without it announcing itself. The seal on the flap was intact. I didn't touch it yet. "When did you write this?" I asked. 14 months ago, he said. When I first understood what Randall was doing and began to understand what it might eventually require. He held it toward me. "I hoped you'd never need to open it." I reached for it. I took it from his hand and turned it over. The flap was sealed, the seal intact, the edges crisp in the way that something is crisp when it has been placed carefully and not disturbed. I slid my finger under the edge and opened it with the same care I'd given everything that afternoon, and I took out the papers inside. There were 3 sheets. I set the envelope on the desk. I unfolded the papers and laid them in front of me, and I read the first page before I allowed myself to look at the others. The first was a 1-page summary document, clean and clearly organized in the format that accountants use when they want their work to be understood rather than merely filed. A statement of assets held by Kane Capital Partners, its subsidiary funds, and the personal holdings of Wade Kane, as of the date 14 months prior, verified by an independent accounting firm whose name and license number were printed at the bottom alongside their certification statement. The number at the bottom of the page, total portfolio value, was $478 million. I looked at that number for a moment. Not with shock. I had known, in the general way that I had known, since the Tuesday afternoon in July when I was 22 years old and my father had unlocked this same drawer and laid the manila folder on this same desk. I had known the broad shape of it. But there is a difference between knowing the shape of a thing and reading the specific number in a certified summary document in a room where you are 32 years old and your cheekbone carries the yellow-green edge of a bruise that is 2 days old and your marriage is in a state of uncertain suspension and the specific number is what it is. I read it again. Then I set the first sheet carefully on the desk, aligned with the blotter edge, and I picked up the second. It was a trust document. One page, dense with legal language in the particular compressed format of formal trust instruments, the language that is required to be precise and therefore sacrifices readability entirely in the service of precision. But the operative sentences were clear, written in plain terms that could not be misread. A revocable living trust, established in my name as sole beneficiary, funded with a 40% interest in Kane Capital Partners, a transfer that had been executed not 14 months ago but 11 years ago, when I was 22 years old. The date on the document was the second Tuesday of July of the year I graduated from the University of Oregon and came home for the summer. The day after he'd first shown me the folder. I sat down. The chair was the same chair I'd sat in that July afternoon 11 years ago when he'd first shown me the company. The same desk. The same study. The magnolia outside the window was the same magnolia, taller now by however much a magnolia grows in 11 years, its branch moving against the glass in the November wind. 11 years, I said. The day after I showed you the company, he said. He was standing beside the desk, hands at his sides, watching me read with the expression of a man who is not performing patience, who is simply, genuinely patient, in the way that someone is patient when they have been waiting for a long time for the right moment and understand that the right moment requires being still. I'd been meaning to formalize it for a while. Seeing you sit in that chair and read those pages made the timing clear. I looked at the trust document. A 40% interest in a portfolio currently valued at $478 million was a number I sat with in my father's study and did not say out loud, because saying it out loud was not the point and had never been the point, which was exactly what the document in my hands had been trying to tell me for 11 years from inside a sealed envelope in a locked drawer. The point was the date. 11 years ago. Before Colton. Before Portland, before the anniversary dinner, before Randall's toast and the river and the November cold and Daphne's voice, saying she's always been sensitive to a table full of people who had decided in advance what kind of person I was. 11 years ago my father had looked at a 22-year-old version of me sitting in this chair and had decided something about who she was and what she deserved, and he had made it formal and legal, and he had put it in a cream envelope with her name on it, and he had locked it in the drawer and he had not mentioned it. Because the mention would have changed everything it was designed not to change. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. My voice was steady and quiet. Same reason I didn't tell Colton, he said. It wasn't the point. You weren't supposed to make decisions based on what you had, you were supposed to make decisions based on who you were. If you'd known about the trust, you'd have spent years wondering whether every relationship you had was colored by it. Whether people were responding to you or to the trust. Whether your own choices were free or contingent. He paused, and his voice settled into the lower register he used for the things he'd thought about the most. I was wrong about some of that. I can see now that withholding it had its own costs. You were in that house, at that table, for 5 years, without the one piece of information that might have changed what you were willing to accept from that family. I looked at the third sheet. It was simpler than the others. A single typed page, recent. The date was 3 weeks ago, and it was an internal memo from Kane Capital Partners to its legal counsel, expansion of trust distribution. The memo directed the firm's attorneys to prepare documents converting the revocable trust to an irrevocable one, to be executed at the discretion of the grantor. It was formatted plainly, the way internal memos are formatted. No letterhead, no flourish, just the date and the subject and the directive and my father's initials at the bottom. 3 weeks ago, I said. I had a feeling the timeline was accelerating, he said. I wanted it formalized before anything happened that might complicate the picture. The irrevocable structure means the transfer is complete regardless of what comes next. Regardless of what Randall's attorneys try to argue about my involvement in the investigation, regardless of any claim that my cooperation with the DOJ was motivated by something other than what it was motivated by. I laid all 3 sheets on the desk beside the Aldrich Voss letter. 4 documents now, side by side, overlapping slightly at the edges. I looked at them in sequence. The asset summary, the trust document 11 years old, the expansion memo, the warning letter to Randall, and I understood them as a single thing. Not a collection of separate papers but one continuous structure. assembled across 14 months and 11 years and 31 years, the architecture of a man who noticed things and filed them in the right place and waited for the moment when they could actually do something. The door of the study was open, and from somewhere in the house came the faint sound of the magnolia branch against the side window, the November wind finding it. The same sound it had made since I was a child falling asleep in a room 2 doors down, the same sound that had been background to every important conversation I'd ever had in this house. I thought about Randall Hale's face in the conference room when Margaret O'Sea's voice had come through the phone. The reorganization of it. The cold calculation behind the performance, the rapid inventory of what was known and what wasn't and what could still be managed. I thought about his exit statement, what happens inside a family is a private matter, and how he'd said it in that room twice, the second time with the weight of a man who believed he was closing something, who believed that phrase was a door he could lock the same way my father's filing cabinet locked, containing the important things where no accident could reach them. He didn't know about the trust. Colton didn't know. Beverly didn't know. Daphne, with her pleasant careful assessments and her inherited instinct for pressure points, had no idea that the woman she'd called sensitive in front of 400 people on an anniversary night was sitting on a trust instrument that was 11 years old and irrevocable by the time any of them learned it existed. 14 months of building, and the thing that would matter most to Randall Hale. Not the fraud investigation, not the DOJ, not even the cooperation of his bank contact, was sitting in 4 documents on a desk in a study in Sacramento, in a house where the magnolia outside had been dropping petals since before I was born. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Colton. 7 words. Dad's attorney just called him. Can we talk? I set the phone face down on the desk. My father was watching me. He's going to find out, I said. About all of it. The DOJ, the letter, the trust. He'll figure out the shape of it and he'll tell Colton and Colton will call back and the conversation that happens next will be the one that decides what comes after this. Yes, my father said. I want to be the one to tell Colton about the trust, I said. Not Randall. Not his attorney. Me. My father considered this. Then he nodded once. That's right, he said. I looked back at the 4 documents on the desk. I thought about what Randall had said in the conference room, you have no idea what you're starting, what this family is capable of, and then I thought about the thing he'd said underneath that, the thing that was the thing, you will never be the most important person at any table I sit at. Not today. Not ever. And I thought about my father's table. This table. This desk, this study, this drawer that had been locked for 31 years and that contained, among other things, a cream envelope with my name on it that was 11 years old and had never once needed to announce itself. I picked up my phone. I texted Colton back, tomorrow. Come to my father's house. Come alone. The response came in 11 seconds, okay. I set the phone down again and looked at the documents. Then I looked at my father. He said, Randall, in the conference room, what happens inside a family is a private matter, I said. He believes that. He's going to keep believing it right up until the moment he understands what's actually in the family he was dismissing. My father's expression, very briefly, was the one I'd seen only a few times in my life. The one that wasn't quite a smile but was the internal architecture of one, the structural frame of something that would have been a smile if he'd been someone who made those kinds of announcements about how he felt. He'll understand it tomorrow, he said. When Colton tells him. And when Colton tells him, I said, everything Randall decided about who I was and what I came from and what table I deserved to sit at. I looked at the trust document. The date on it. 11 years old. He'll have to do that math himself, I said. Colton arrived at 10:40 the next morning. I heard the car in the driveway from the kitchen, where I'd been sitting with coffee and the particular quality of November light that comes through east-facing windows in Sacramento. Thin, specific, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything but shows everything clearly, the light of a month that has stopped pretending to be summer and has committed to being what it is. I'd been up since 6. I hadn't slept past 6 since the anniversary dinner, and I didn't expect to for a while yet, and I'd made a kind of peace with that. Some disruptions change the interior schedule. You don't fight them into the old shape, you let the new shape find itself. My father had been in his study since 8. The door was open, which meant what it always meant. I set down my mug and I went to the front door and I opened it before Colton could knock. He looked like a man who had spent the night in a conversation he hadn't been prepared for. His eyes had the redness of interrupted sleep, and there was a quality to his stillness on the front porch, something stripped back, something that had had the performance removed from it. That was the most honest I had seen him look in a long time. He was wearing a dark sweater and the jeans he wore on weekends, clothes he'd clearly put on without thinking about them. No jacket despite the cold. His hands were in his pockets, and he was looking at me with the expression of a man who has been thinking about what he wants to say and has arrived at the understanding that none of what he prepared is quite right. "Come in," I said. He came in. He looked around the front hallway of my father's house with the expression of someone seeing a place properly for the first time after having seen it casually several times before. The photographs on the wall. My mother in her 30s, my father at a desk that was younger than the one currently in his study, me at various ages in the straightforward documentary style of someone who photographs life because life is worth photographing and not because the photographs will be seen. The runner on the hardwood floor, worn pale at the center from 30 years of foot traffic. The particular smell of the house. Wood, paper, old wool, and underneath all of it the faint sweetness from the magnolia outside that was always slightly present regardless of the season, something that had worked its way into the walls over decades and wasn't leaving. I brought him into the kitchen. I poured him coffee without asking. He sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the mug the way people wrap their hands around warmth when they're cold in a way that isn't entirely physical, and he looked at the surface of the coffee for a moment before he looked at me. "He called me at 11 last night," Colton said. "My father." His attorney had called him, and then he called me. He stopped. I've never heard him sound like that. In my entire life. Not when the market dropped and he lost the Burnside property the first time. Not when his father died. Never. I sat down across from him. I waited. "He said that your father had." He was talking about the DOJ, the fraud investigation, and he kept using words like coordinated and orchestrated, like the whole thing had been constructed against him, and then he said something about a trust, about money, about your father's firm, and I couldn't follow the specifics because he wasn't being specific. He was being loud, which is what he does when he's lost the thread. Colton pressed his mouth together. I didn't understand most of it. He kept saying you'd been hiding something. That the whole marriage was a setup, that your father had been. He stopped again, harder this time, and shook his head with the particular motion of someone refusing a thought rather than simply ending a sentence. I told him to stop talking. For the first time in my entire life, I told my father to stop talking, and I ended the call. I looked at him. His hands around the mug were very tight, the knuckles showing the pressure of it. "It wasn't a setup," I said. "I know that," he said. "I know." I knew it while he was saying it. The words were coming through the phone, and I was hearing them, and simultaneously knowing they weren't true, which is a disorienting thing to experience about your father's version of events. He looked at me. "But I also don't know what's true. I don't know what you have, what your father has, I don't know what our marriage was built on or what it wasn't, and I feel like..." His voice caught briefly, something moving through it that he didn't try to hide, and then it steadied. "I feel like I've been standing in a house I thought I understood, and someone has just shown me that the foundation is not where I believed it was." I set down my own mug. I looked at my husband. The words still fit, technically, legally for now, and I was letting it fit until I'd decided otherwise, and I said, "I'll tell you everything. What my father has, what the trust is, all of it. But I want to tell you one thing first." He nodded. "I didn't know about the trust when we got married," I said. "I didn't know the specific number, the specific structure. My father told me about the company when I was 22, the broad shape of it, that it existed, that it was significant. But the trust, the 40% interest, the formalized legal structure. I found that out 2 days ago in this house, sitting in the same chair you're sitting in, reading a document that was dated 11 years ago." I paused. "I married you because I wanted to marry you. Not because of anything else. Not as a strategy, not as a setup, not with any architecture behind it except the ordinary architecture of wanting to build a life with someone I chose." Colton was quiet for a long time. Outside, the magnolia branch moved against the side of the house in a brief, light percussion of wind. The kitchen was warm. The coffee was steaming between his hands. "I believe you," he said. I know, I said. And I know that doesn't fix everything. It doesn't fix what happened at the restaurant. It doesn't fix what I've been carrying for 5 years, what you've let your father do in rooms where I was present, what you chose when he required something of you on a night that should have been ours. I let that sit for a moment, not as an accusation but as a fact that needed to exist in the air between us before anything else could. Those things are real and separate, and they have their own process. His eyes dropped. I know, he said. His voice was low. Not the managed low of a man controlling his register for effect, but the actual low of a man who has run out of management and is speaking from underneath it. I know what I did. What I've done. The fork and in that car, driving home from every Sunday dinner, telling you it didn't mean anything, that he was just like that you shouldn't take it. He looked up. I was telling you that for my benefit. Not yours. Because naming it would have required me to do something about it. I looked at him for a long moment. Yes, I said. That's accurate. Is there anything? He started. Then he stopped himself, and I recognized the stop. The recognition that whatever he'd been about to ask was a question whose answer he hadn't yet earned the right to receive. He held the question back. That was new. Tell me about the trust, he said instead. So I did. I told it plainly, in sequence, without editorializing, the way my father had taught me to report things, in the order they happened, with the details that mattered, without decorating them in emotion they didn't need because the facts were already enough. I told him about the company, and the folder, and the Tuesday afternoon in July when I was 22 and sat in this kitchen chair, and a version of this conversation had its first draft. I told him about the original document dated 11 years ago. The 40% trust, the revocable structure, the date that preceded everything else by years. I told him about the asset summary, the number at the bottom of the page, what it meant arithmetically. I told him about Carver Street and the other 3 properties and the 2-column summary sheet my father had laid on the conference table that afternoon. I told him about Margaret Osei and the cooperation agreement and what the DOJ had been reviewing for 9 days. I told him about Dennis Achterberg and the 11 years of structured fraud and the board member at the bank who had approved terms he knew were based on assessments he knew were false. And I told him about the letter. The Aldrich Voss letter, registered mail, 8 months ago, confirmation of receipt. Colton listened without interrupting. He held his coffee and he listened, and when I got to the letter, 8 months ago, registered mail, something moved through his face that I hadn't seen there before. Not anger. Something quieter and more fundamental. The expression of a person who is recalculating every Sunday dinner of the past 8 months in real time, understanding now what his father had been carrying into those rooms and had chosen, every single time, to conceal from his own son. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the house sounds and the November outside doing its November work against the windows. He's going to prison, Colton said. Not a question. Not a declaration. A statement of understanding, the way you state something once you've finished the calculation. That's not my decision, I said. That's the DOJ's and his attorneys and what he does from here. The cooperation agreement with Achterberg is substantial. The 4 properties are documented. What that becomes in a courtroom or a plea negotiation is a process I'm not part of. Colton was looking at the table. The worn surface of it. 30 years of homework and meals and conversations, and the particular physical record of a house that had been used and lived in rather than maintained for appearance. He built everything on that portfolio, he said. The firm. The address. The reputation in the Pearl District, the social connections, the way he walked into a room and the room responded. All of it was predicated on what the portfolio was worth and how he'd built it. He stopped. And he knew this was coming. He knew for 8 months from the letter, and he pressed 2 fingers to his forehead briefly. He sat at dinner tables and talked about legacy. I didn't fill the silence. He needed the silence. Not because I was withholding something, but because some understandings require their own space to complete themselves, and interrupting that space with words, even accurate, useful words, is its own kind of taking. What happens to the firm? He asked after a while. That depends on what the investigation finds and what charges are ultimately filed. There'll be a process. It won't be fast and it won't be clean. The properties will be reviewed. The loan structures will be audited. The business relationships that were predicated on the fraudulent valuations will be examined. How much of that reaches the operating firm and how much is isolated to Randall personally, that's what the attorneys will negotiate. He nodded slowly. Then he looked up at me. And the trust? The 40%. He said it carefully, like something he was still learning the weight of, turning it over to find which way it was heaviest. That's... Yes, I said. I didn't say the number. He could do the arithmetic. He was doing it now. I could see it happening, the specific quality of stillness that comes over a person when a number is assembling itself in their head and the assembled number is not what they expected. When it finished assembling, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, in 5 years of looking at his face across various tables and rooms. Not the organized Colton, not the managed impression Colton, not the Colton who had spent 2 decades learning to perform ease in rooms his father was also performing in. Something underneath all of that, something that had been stripped of its layering by 48 hours of events it hadn't been prepared for. Genuinely undone and genuinely trying. Presley, he said. His voice was quiet. All the things my father said about you. The spirited girl. The girl who came from nothing and was reaching for something she wasn't born to. The comment about East Sacramento. Every dinner, every golf course story, every conversation where he implied. His voice dropped. He was sitting at a table with Wade Kane's daughter and treating her like she should be grateful to be there. He was sitting at a table with me, I said. That's the part one needs you to understand. Not what the trust is, not the number, not whose daughter I am. Me. That's who was at every one of those tables. And the question of whether I deserve to be treated the way I was treated at those tables has nothing to do with what's in a locked drawer in Sacramento. It has to do with who I am, and who you are, and what we were willing to accept from each other and from your father. Colton was quiet for a long time. I know, he said finally. I should have known that without any of this. I did know it. I just kept choosing the version of knowing it that didn't require me to act on it. He looked at his hands. That's not the same as knowing it. I understand that now. It's a start, I said, that you understand it now. My father came into the kitchen at noon. He shook Colton's hand. Briefly, without theatrics, the handshake of a man acknowledging the person in front of him without making a declaration about what they were to each other. Not yet, not today. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and looked at the window and the magnolia outside it and the November sky beyond that. I owe you an apology, Colton said to him. For my father. For what I allowed to happen, in my house, in my family's house, over 5 years. I'm not going to make that into a speech. My father looked at him. He held the look for a moment, assessing not unkindly. That apology belongs to Presley, he said. I'll let you two work out what it's worth. Colton looked at me. I looked back at him. We're not fixed, I said. I want you to hear that clearly. What happened at the restaurant, what happened in 5 years of Sunday dinners and car rides home and you looking at your fork, that's not resolved because of a trust document or because your father is facing a DOJ investigation. Those are separate things. I know, he said. But, I said, and I let the words sit for a moment before I continued, I'm not interested in burning everything down for the sake of burning it. If there's something real here, if you're capable of being something different from what you were in that restaurant, I'm willing to find out what that looks like. Slowly. Without a guarantee. Colton was very still. That's more than I deserve right now, he said. Yes, I said. It is. 1. What you build with your hands, the hours billed, the problems found and solved, the calls returned, the work done correctly when no one is watching and the only record is the work itself, does not disappear because someone with a louder claim decides they deserve it more. Records exist. Documents exist. The work itself exists. And the people who watched you do it remember. 2. Preparation is a form of love. My grandfather spent 3 years making sure that when the moment came, there was no argument left to have, not because he wanted a confrontation, but because he wanted the confrontation to be brief. He could not protect me from my family. He could make sure they ran out of ground to stand on. That is what he spent 32 years doing, and 3 more doing deliberately, and it is the most patient and practical expression of love I have ever been given. 3. Bravery at a wedding is not walking down the aisle. Sometimes it is reaching across a table for a wig that someone pulled off your head, setting it back on in front of 200 people, and continuing to eat your dinner. And sometimes, an hour later, it is deciding that you are done performing normalcy for the people who made the normalcy necessary, and taking it off and sitting in your own skin, in a lit-up room full of people who love you and staying anyway. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real emotional truths many families carry. If any part of this reminded you of your own experience, the quiet work that went unrecognized, the room where someone finally said enough, the morning after when you didn't know yet what came next, tell me where you're watching from. That's where part 2 begins.